So today, I will definitely let him do any other further introductions. I know you've seen it in the newsletter and as well as on our site, but we have with us Charles Cyna, who's the president of ThinkITSM Corp, talking about implementing a customer satisfaction measurement program that drives service improvement. I know Charles has been with us before, so welcome back, Charles, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks very much, Rick, and welcome everyone to this presentation. I'm happy to be here. So today we are going to talk about customer satisfaction programs, and it's a little bit of a follow-up session. I spoke at Fort Rock last year, and we talked about building out an executive scorecard, and one of the measures in the executive scorecard was customer satisfaction or client satisfaction. And a lot of questions that we often get when we talk about that scorecard is, well, we're not happy with how, we capture client satisfaction. Are there better ways of, measuring client satisfaction? So this is where this presentation came from. So today we're going to try and share with you a surveying methodology. Surveying is typically the method of choice to capture customer satisfaction, and so that's where we're going to be focusing in the limited time that we have today. We're going to provide an opportunity to talk about what some organizations have been doing in terms of customer satisfaction measurement. And we're going to hopefully provide everyone with the opportunity to move through the survey creation process, all associated with satisfaction measurement. And there are a number of things that we're going to sort of cover off. And I have a bit of a confession that I originally delivered this presentation actually as an HDI workshop a couple of weeks ago. And it was about 2.5 hours, and so I've trimmed it down to about 40 minutes, and I left some slides in that we're not going to necessarily be able to spend a lot of time on in this particular session, but if you download the presentation, it's there so you can refer back to some of the items in a little bit more detail. So we're going to talk about client satisfaction first. We're going to decide on whether it's a good idea to even measure it. We're going to discuss some of the areas around low client satisfaction. We're going to see that as an industry whether we actually get accurate client satisfaction scores. When I talk about us as an industry, I'm really speaking about IT. We're going to talk about how we can actually build different types of surveys for different types of stakeholders, and we're going to look at a plan that you can actually implement based on what the information in your client satisfaction survey is telling you. So we've got a lot of information that we're going to try and cover, and Rick has assured me that if I'm going over, he's gonna let me know. So I'm calling this Let's Baseline. We're not really going to baseline because we're sort of in a virtual room here and no one's going to really talk to each other. But if you are about to embark on a client satisfaction measurement program, these are the questions that you want to ask yourself right up front. You don't just want to start doing a client survey or say, you know what, we want to survey our clients. You want to really figure out, why we're doing it. Do you even care about client satisfaction? That's an important question, and there are some actually valid reasons in the IT community as to why you might care and why you might not care about what your clients actually think about the service that you deliver. You might want to understand how you're actually going to capture client satisfaction information. Surveys are just one of many things that you could potentially do to actually understand how satisfied your clients are. You might look at what you're doing today. Are we actually doing any type of surveying? If we are, who are we surveying within the organization? How frequently are we doing? What types of surveys are we doing? And what are we doing with the information? Before you embark on any type of measurement program, you probably want to just ask yourself these questions, note them down, and make sure that you really understand where you are today before you embark on any additional steps. So, going back to that question, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but there's a school of thought that says, well, you know what, we're in IT, we're not necessarily managing traditional paying customers in many respects, and should IT even care about client satisfaction? There's a mindset out there that says, well, IT ultimately is a bit of a monopoly. Where else are people going to go, even if they're not particularly satisfied, and they're not really customers because they're not paying, they're really sort of consuming the service. So there's sort of an argument on one side of the fence, and then on the other side of the fence, you have folks who say, well, client satisfaction actually can be important because within an organization it actually helps with morale. I'm actually married to a lawyer who's a partner in a Bay Street firm in Toronto, and she gets incredibly frustrated with the IT department to the point where I have to listen to her sort of talk to me about it, for several hours a week. And so I actually think that the small issues, build up over a period of time, and it's important to really understand what they are before they get out of control. According to the Gartner Group, IT perception, or at least 70% or 75% of IT perception, is generated by the desktop and the service desk groups. And so you've really got a great opportunity to improve IT perception by really understanding whether your clients, your customers, your users, whatever you want to call them, are actually happy with the service that you're providing. Of course, we mostly realize that IT is no longer a monopoly. With the advent of cloud computing, many IT services are being pushed out to third-party vendors, and IT's role is very much changing. If I sort of bring up this sort of macro view as terms of the big picture, in terms of the business, there's been a bunch of stuff that's really been happening in terms of the economic downturn, increased technology proliferation in terms of mobile and globalization, i.e. the ability and ease of organizations to transfer commodity-based resources and push them to less expensive parts of the globe. So IT is really faced with the challenge where they have to justify their existence, and that existence is around generating value in terms of the role evolution. It's no longer just good enough for us to provide commodity-based services. We have to provide value-based services. And within that, we have the service desk and IT sort of operations, and the continual thing that we're asking ourselves is, well, we don't want to just be a commodity, just handling transactions within the organization. We want to actually demonstrate value. And so asking that question, how do we show value to the business? Well, it's really important for us to understand what the business thinks of the services that we supply. And so customer satisfaction really becomes a great indicator and insight into what people are actually thinking about. And so, this role of IT is changing, where we have to be sort of more value focused, and you're not just hearing it here, you probably hear it everywhere, or every time you sign up for one of these types of events. And it feeds into this sort of value proposition of the service desk. So in my last presentation, I don't expect you to remember it, but in my last presentation, I presented this sort of value scorecard, and we talked about, well, what is the value of the service desk? And the value of the service desk is really about reducing cost, to the organization. The reason that service desks were in place in the first place is that they didn't want people, end users, to call sort of very expensive resources in IT and sort of distract them from the big projects that they're doing. So we thought we could have some lower cost resources, take those calls, and free up that time. And so cost is really an important value proposition. But we also found that if we don't deliver quality, people aren't going to use the service, and so we're not actually going to achieve the goal of reducing the cost of service delivery. And so there's a real balance. And in the last presentation, we showed you a scorecard, and on that scorecard, the very first measure we talked about was client satisfaction. And so today, we're going to say, well, how do I actually get to a single measure of client satisfaction? So I suppose before we, we go on, it's probably worth our while just sort of looking at client satisfaction or customer satisfaction and go to some definitions. And in writing this presentation, I went and read a bunch of different studies and research papers, and I found sort of 3 definitions that I actually thought were really good. And they're a little bit wordy, and I encourage you to sort of download this presentation and sort of look at them because they really talk about client satisfaction as really perceptions between what I'm experiencing and my previous experiences. And this is really a challenge in terms of coming up with a measure, because if you're measuring something that's really absolute, i.e. like I'm driving a particular speed in a car, I'm either going 50 miles an hour or I'm not going 50 miles an hour. However, when I'm measuring something like customer satisfaction, the customer satisfaction level that I'm measuring is purely in relation to my previous perceptions of either a similar service or a competitive service that I've been exposed to. And because we all come from different walks of life with different experiences, it really becomes very difficult to get sort of a standardized way of interpreting how satisfied people are. So I encourage you to read these in your own time and sort of internalize them, because I think they're great definitions. So in terms of understanding why people aren't happy with service, if we look at those definitions, it's about differences in expectations. Well, there are 5 different expectation gaps that we need to understand if we're going to be able to understand why you can get negative client satisfaction scores. The first gap is what we call the promotional gap. And this is where what you say about the service differs from what is delivered. So, I use this, I use an example from the service desk. For example, when I call up my cable company, the very first thing that they tell me is that that this call is important to them. And then I'm on hold for the next sort of 35 minutes. And that promotional gap is a cause of dissatisfaction, because I'm told that the call is important to them, but then I receive a very different type of experience. And so, don't tell me that the call is important to me, because I know if the call is important to me, you would have just picked up the telephone and I'd be speaking to somebody. So it really is that the call isn't that important to them. So the promotional gap, is something that can cause customer service dissatisfaction. Then there's the understanding gap. This is where the service provider's perception of consumer expectation is inaccurate. And so, in IT, the service provider is the IT department, and our perception of what the consumer's expectations are inaccurate. So in an organization where we don't have service level agreements in place, we often don't really understand what the expectations are of the business to be able to provide them a suitable level of client satisfaction. And then we have gap number 3, the procedural gap. This is where our consumer's expectation is not translated into appropriate procedures. So, for example, if someone who has experiences a break-fix issue within my environment, I call up the service desk and I actually expect to speak to somebody who's knowledgeable. But maybe the phone system doesn't actually pass me through to the correct person based on the prompts that were actually entered. And maybe when the ticket is assigned to an escalation group, it doesn't go to the right escalation group and it gets bounced around a few times. And so there's a gap in terms of what my expectation is of being able to speak to somebody knowledgeable and what is actually in place. There's the behavioral gap. This is when the service being delivered is different from the specification of the service. And so this is where we buy a new service management tool, we implement ITIL, and then nobody actually follows any of the procedures, rules, roles, and responsibilities that we actually established. I've got second-line support personnel who aren't updating their tickets. I've got people who aren't following the rules of engagement when it comes to reassigning tickets within the service desk, for example. And so we have to handle behavioral issues actually within the service provider in terms of the IT department. And then you have gap 5. And this is where the level of service perceived by consumers differs from the service actually being provided. And this can be the case where if I call my end users customers, I can create a perception gap, because we're told our whole life that customers are always right. And so the consumer of the IT service believes that they're a customer, and so if anything goes wrong, they basically are dissatisfied. The reality is that the end user within the organization aren't really the customer. They're a consumer of the IT service. The customer has to have some type of financial component in terms of a transaction that needs to be taken place. And so it's very easy for IT departments to fall into perception issues if we keep calling our end users customers on an ongoing basis. So the challenges that we have, not only is, we understand why we might get sort of poor customer satisfaction, but the challenges that we actually have in being able to track customer satisfaction are listed on this sheet. How do we make scoring objective, okay? And, making scoring objective on a one-time survey is one thing, but if I want to make scoring relevant over time, it's far more challenging, because I might want to swap my questions out, for example. I don't want to ask the same thing again and again. The next question is, do some surveys overestimate or underestimate the satisfaction scores of recipients? So, I'll use an example. I got myself a fancy new smartphone fairly recently, and I was really delighted with it. I didn't unbox myself on YouTube or anything like that, but basically I was very excited, except after a couple of weeks I called up my wireless provider, and I said, I've got this particular issue. Now, they were actually very helpful. They provided an immediate response, and they sent me a survey right afterwards, and I filled it out, and I said, I was very satisfied. And then about, I don't know, I think a few days later, another issue occurred, and I went through the same kind of process, and I was actually dealt with very professionally, and they sent me a survey, and they asked me about the specific experience, and so again, I responded that I was very happy with that experience. And then the same thing happened again a third time, and we went through the same process. And the third survey wasn't quite as good, but it was really limiting my responses to the specific experience. And so here I had 3 interactions with the support desk. Each interaction itself was actually quite pleasurable, and I got a resolution at customer first contact. And yet the overall ownership experience of my smartphone was actually not that great. And so if we focus too much on the transactional aspect of actually asking someone how we did with a specific transaction, are we really understanding the person's overall experience with their usage of IT within our organization? So the approach that we're going to talk about today is that we want to have a goal for processing results. We want to establish a repeatable framework. We don't want to just send out a survey and then come up with a different framework in 2 weeks' time and send out another survey, and then read another blog, somewhere else, and then change our survey methodology again. I don't really care, and I don't necessarily think you should necessarily care that much about which methodology you should pick. There's a bunch of methodologies out there. I'm presenting a particular methodology today. I just think you've got to pick one methodology, and you want to stick with that methodology for at least 12 months. And then at the end of the 12-month period, you can evaluate how effective it was, and if it's not working for you, then go with another methodology. But don't sort of stop and start on a weekly basis or a monthly basis, adding and subtracting methodologies in terms of what you're doing for client satisfaction measurement. You want to decide upon your stakeholder groups that are going to have the most impact. And so in the IT process, you've got consumers. These are the end users, the people that are end users that consume our IT services. And we have the practitioners. And the practitioners are the people and the folks within our IT department who deliver client satisfaction. So those are probably the two biggest stakeholder groups that you might want to survey if you're starting a measurement program. There are some other stakeholder groups that we're going to talk about in a few minutes. You need to establish a survey frequency. Are we just going to do a transactional survey, or are we also going to do some annual surveys as well? We're going to talk about that in a few moments. And then we don't just need to survey, we need to decide what we're going to do with the information. One of the number one things that organizations do is that they're pretty good at surveying, but then they're not so good at actually doing anything with the information that they've gathered. So there are 3 steps here. We're going to do a survey setup. We're going to agree to a measurement model that everyone buys into. We're going to identify those recipients and frequency. We're going to perform a baseline survey. Performing the baseline survey is very important because it tells you a snapshot of where you are today. And then once you're going to execute that baseline survey, and then you're going to analyze and look at what the survey is actually telling you. And there's basically a very simple process of building out a customer satisfaction survey, and I'm showing it on this screen. We're going to go through each one of these in each step. So defining the objectives. What do we want to do with the information that we gather? Do we want to benchmark? There's a lot of talk right now in the IT industry where we want to benchmark ourselves against other organizations. Now, I think that there's some validity on benchmarking yourself in a lot of different measures, but you've got to ask yourself, well, is there any value in benchmarking customer satisfaction? And my question around that is that customer satisfaction is such an intangible that, are you going to get value looking at how satisfied your people are based on a particular methodology versus other organizations who are doing who are potentially measuring themselves with a different methodology? Do you want to measure that you're knowing that you're doing a good job? I would argue that the number one outcome for client service measurement is actually service improvement. So here I plagiarized the diagram from the OGC ITIL version 3 CSI, Continual Service Improvement book, and I suggest that organizations look at surveying as a way to drive improvements in performance. And the driving improvements in performance is really about where are we now. Surveys provide great insight into as part of your measurement toolkit. You've got stuff that's coming from your service desk tool. You probably have some stuff that's coming from accounting. Well, this is stuff that's coming from the specific perceptions of your end users. Where are you now? And then from that, you can look at the data and you might say, well, where do we want to be? And you could figure out a plan of where you want to get there. I would argue that this is more valuable in an IT department than saying, okay, we want to measure customer service because we want to benchmark ourselves against other organizations, or we want to feel good about the job that we're necessarily doing. I would say that they're probably secondary, at least in my opinion. So you decide that you actually want to do the survey. You're going to now develop some type of research design. So you're going to say, well, what methods are we going to use to collect the information? How are we going to gather the information? And who are we going to gather the information from? So there's basically a number of things that you can do. There's sort of what I call research, and there's operational data. Research would be things like surveys, and that's really where the focus is on this particular presentation. However, one of the things that businesses do is that they have the concept of mystery shoppers, where they send, somebody out to the store and they sort of experience what the customer experience is. Well, there's no reason that IT shouldn't be leveraging that particular model to actually get a user experience. Let's have some mystery IT shoppers, having break-fix issues with their computers within the environment, and see what type of experience that they get. You should also look at potentially doing consumer visits. Hospitals and universities are often very good at this. They call it rounding, where you sort of pop in on a weekly basis or whatever time period it happens to be to meet with your users and find out proactively what their experiences are with the services that has been applied. If that's not possible, you can actually even organize focus groups where you invite people from the business into your domain and ask them various questions in sort of an interactive focus type group. Then you have operational information that you would look at in conjunction with the surveys. So you'd look at your incident and service request analysis. You'd look at reopened issues particularly, and then there are some key metrics that you might want to look at: mean time to restore service, service level agreement, resolutions within a service level agreement, first point of contact resolution. These metrics tie very nicely into in a complementary way when you're looking at survey results, because you don't just want to look at your survey results, you want to just try and tie those survey results back to the operational information. And you want to try and create links and say, you know what, I noticed that my mean time to restore service spiked by 15% this month, and when that happened, I actually noticed that our customer sat scores actually dropped by 0.3. And by making these correlations, you can start justifying business cases for making improvements in service by saying, you know what caused that mean time to restore service increase? Oh, it's a bunch of servers that we've been asking to replace for the last couple of years. Well, it was expensive, but let's justify the business case by actually saying that it's impacting the perception of IT within the organization, and what is that worth for us? So then the next thing is we need to decide, well, who we're actually serving. So we talked about consumers. So these are the people who consume IT services, or end users. You notice I don't really call them customers because they're not paying for the service, they're receiving the service. There are IT practitioners. I kind of break IT practitioners into two main groups: the actual people on the front line of the service desk, or sort of the first tier of the service desk, and then I kind of bunch everybody else. And I call them escalation groups. But these are your network, your infrastructure group, your desktop group potentially, depending on how your organization is structured. And I would normally have two different types of surveys for each of these groups. Then you have executives. The executives are typically the customers in most organizations, because these are the people who are actually paying for the service. And there are two types of surveys that you would kind of run here, is that you would run a survey asking the business what they think of IT, and then you would ask IT the same survey and say, answer this as if you were the business. And then you're going to actually see how closely aligned these two groups are. What I did was I kind of looked at the types of surveys that I felt that an organization should be running if improvement is the goal. So if you're interested in benchmarking, or if you're interested in something else, you're probably going to have different types of surveys that you're going to come up with. But if you're interested in improving the service delivery, then I think that these are the surveys that you should be running potentially. So for your end users, there's two types of surveys. There's what I call transactional surveys and overall perception surveys. A transactional survey typically happens at the end of an incident or a service request, and you close it in your service management tool, and the system sends out a survey, and they're going to ask you about the particular experience. Now, what a lot of organizations do is they send out the same survey no matter what happened on the service desk. I suggest that there's three variants of surveys that you want to send out on a transactional. You want to send out a survey for tickets that are solved at first point of contact. You want to send out a different survey for tickets that are escalated. You want to ask different types of questions. And you want to send a different survey for service requests. People complain that they don't get good results back from surveys. Well, the number one thing to fix is ask questions that are relevant to the experience that the person actually had. And there's nothing worse than sort of asking questions that just don't make any sense, because people just can't be bothered to sort of invent either fake information or sort of read things that don't apply to them. Then, because we kind of talked about that transactional thing that happened with my smartphone, where I had very happy transactions, but my overall experience was less than happy, it's important to also do overall perception surveys. And these would typically be done once a year, and they don't really relate to anything specifically. And there are two types of surveys that you'd want to do. One, for people who have actually called the service desk. And then the most important one that you want to do is for the people who haven't called the service desk. The reality is in an IT organization, everyone should be calling the service desk. And I want to basically produce a report every year or every month and say, okay, well, probably on an annual basis, but that would say, show me everybody who hasn't used our service. And then I want to reach out to those individuals and find out why they're not using our service. Because if they're not using our service, where are they going with their technical issues? Because the one thing that is true, is death, taxes, and technical support issues. So the reality is that they're experiencing technical support issues, but where are they going to have them resolved? And it's our job on the service desk to really understand that. Then, from the IT perspective, our practitioners, we have the overall perception. These are probably more important than transactional. The last thing you want to do is burden your IT folks. Every time you close a ticket, you send out a survey to the IT person. That person is going to get 20 tickets a day. It's going to drive them nuts. So what you want to do is do an overall perception and say, what do you think about how things are working from a particular perspective? And there are two types of surveys here. There's the frontline service desk survey that I recommend that people run, and then you have slightly different questions for the escalation support group, and I'm going to show you some results on when you survey these two groups separately. You might find an argument to have a transactional survey that if you get a very low client satisfaction score, i.e. like very low, let's say if you were doing 1 to 5, you scored sort of 2 and below, you might initiate a satisfaction survey to the particular individual in those cases. But I would say that there's arguments to pro and against in that. And then we have executive surveys. Generally with executives, we don't just ask them about the service desk or specific areas. We ask them about overall business value associated with IT. And I'm going to show you later on today how you can get access to sample questions in each one of these groups. So this is one of those slides that I mentioned earlier. I'm not really going to go through it right now, but it basically goes into more detail about how you would build out these particular surveys. And we just don't have time to necessarily cover it here today, but you can read this at your leisure later on. So then the next thing you need to do is to decide to design sort of question types. So if we say that our goal here is to improve things, we suggest when you ask a question regarding satisfaction, you have to sort of relate it. You have to ask a secondary question to give it a weight or a base. And so in this particular case, the way we phrase these questions for a CSI kind of survey where we're going to try and improve things, I ask the question like this. I want you to rate the timeliness of the resolution to your question. And we're going to ask them their satisfaction, and we're going to give them a rating of 1 to 5. 5 would mean that they're most satisfied with the resolution, and 1 would be the least satisfied. Now, because I'm interested in improvement, what I do is I just say to them, you know what, how important, though, is timeliness of the resolution to you? Is it really important, or is it not so important? And what I'm doing here is I'm actually building a reporting measurement system that's going to help me focus my very limited resources on where I need to spend the most time. And so in this particular case, if someone tells me that they're happy with timeliness, but it's actually not that important to them, I know that this isn't an area that I really need to spend any time on. Conversely, if they tell me that it's very important to them and they're not very happy with it, then this becomes a no-brainer, and it goes right up to the top of my list to say, you know what, we really need to focus on timeliness because people are telling us that it's very important to them.
And Charles, can I ask a question? If improvement's not the objective of the survey, how do you change the question structure?
Yeah, so what you would do is you'd keep satisfaction the same, and what you do is you'd swap out importance, and you might swap it out with something else, such as expectations, for example. And you would say, is satisfaction, how satisfied were you and how in line with your expectations? Or if you were selling a service, or if you were providing a service against competitors, for example, and you wanted to see how competitive you were, your second line instead of importance would actually be competitors. So you would rate satisfaction against their perception of how they receive that service from your competitors. There are a list of other things that you could do, other service providers, provider promises, industry norms, but you basically want to weight your satisfaction against another factor to provide more insightful reporting. So this is kind of what it might look like. I said that I would show you an example. I ran two surveys here. One was for an IT service desk, and the other one was escalation groups. And so when I looked at the IT service desk, I get an overall satisfaction score of 2.9. So these are the people who are actually doing support. They're 2.9 out of 5 satisfied in terms of what's happening in terms of the overall service delivery system, practices, processes, communications, all of the things in place. And they rate the overall importance of what they do is at 4.2. And one of the interesting things here is when I did the same survey to, this is actually real data, by the way, when I did the same survey to escalation groups, you actually see a couple of interesting things. Their perception with service delivery was about the same, but in terms of the role of customer service amongst those escalation groups, it was significantly lower. And in this particular organization, there was a challenge where the second-line support personnel really don't validate or provide any type of real respect to the people who are initially doing support, and it causes a whole bunch of process-based issues later on. So we looked at structuring our questions, but what if we want to change our questions out over time? Well, one of the big challenges of doing that is that if I change my questions, is my scoring going to remain accurate and relevant? And so what we do is, instead of just asking questions, we suggest that you come up with a series of survey dimensions, and then you slot your questions in under a particular dimension. And then over time, you can ask different types of questions, but you keep the dimensions the same, and then it allows you to basically monitor that score over a period of time at the dimension level as opposed to the question level. So there are a bunch of methodologies out there in terms of survey dimensions. This is the one that we found that works really well with IT, and it's asking questions around timeliness, reliability, responsiveness, accessibility, communication, and cost and value. And we're just going to touch upon each one of these. So timeliness really looks at how timely were the interactions? Was it at the right time? Was it at an appropriate time? Did you have to wait for action? Was there a timely delivery of service? Reliability. Did we provide the service when it was needed? Did we provide what was promised? Did we adhere to a policy and standards? Was there a minimal error rate? Was there consistency in the service? Okay. Responsiveness. Are we reacting are we responding in an appropriate way? Typical questions under service delivery staff about being considerate, understanding, helpful, knowledgeable, all of those traits around, were my team good? They're typically all are asked under the responsiveness dimension. Then you've got accessibility, our hours of service, whether you had choice on how to log the ticket, was it efficient? Did you feel that there was intelligence involved in terms of being able to, access our services, different types of customers different types of access for different types of customers potentially. Then you have communication. How well did we actually communicate on a particular part of the service? And then cost and value. Was there a reasonable cost? Were we able to demonstrate value to the particular user? For this particular service. You might say that in an IT survey, do you want to even ask questions about cost and value? And you may not, but certainly on the people who are the customer survey, you do want to ask those types of questions. So then, how would this kind of work? Well, you'd get a report, sort of something like this, and what this allows you to do is you get sort of insight, I think, where I look at my satisfaction scores. So my satisfaction scores are all in blue here. And you can sort of see that, communication is where people are most happy with. And I look at reliability and timeliness of the things that people are least happy with. And so when it comes to, because I really want to action this information. Like the whole point of doing this is I want to improve things. And so what this is telling me is that, there are certain areas that I need to, be focusing on. And I can see that timeliness and reliability are potentially important. Now, if I'm trying to prioritize, what I want to do is I want to go back to importance, and I want to say, well, what are the things that people think are most important to them? And so what I'm seeing here is if I'm because I haven't got all the time in the world and all the resources in the world to fix everything, I can just fix the things that are most pressing. And when I look at this, it's telling me that the timeliness things are the biggest issue. It's got the highest importance scores, and it's got the lowest satisfaction scores. And so if I'm going to only be able to fix one thing within my environment, I'm going to focus on timeliness. The next thing I'm going to be able to fix is reliability. Okay, reliability also has my next highest importance score, and it has my lowest satisfaction score. So you kind of get the picture that you use this to start feeding your improvement plans. Now, you don't want to just interpret the data. There's another type of question that you can ask that can make it really clear what you should be focusing on in terms of improvement. We call these overall ranking questions. And what we do is at the end of the survey, you basically say to the person, you know what, you've answered a bunch of stuff. Let's say we got them to answer 4 or 5 questions. To say, of all of those things that we asked you about, if we were to fix, 3 of them, can you just rank the top 3 for us? And, they're going to come in here and they've, rank availability number 1, prompt service desk response number 2, or whatever it happens to be. And then what it gives you is a summary like this. And it really becomes crystallizing because I don't have to necessarily spend a lot of time interpreting my information. I can see that 62% of the time, people ranked accuracy and detail of individual incident information when it's updated by IT groups external to the service desk. This is the number 1 thing that people should improve upon. What was really interesting, this is actually real data, is that when I got this from the escalation group, the number 1 thing that they complained about was accuracy and detail of individual incident information provided by the service desk. So it's really interesting the different perceptions that you get from the 2 different groups. And everyone knows that this exists, but now having core objective information allows me to sort of justify an improvement plan of how I'm going to address it or how I'm going to fix it. So, this links us back to sort of continual service improvement. I now need to do stuff. This is the part, this is like the hard part in continual service improvement. Coming up with the vision and the goals and sort of saying where are we now, everyone kind of loves that. Actually then doing the work to help us get to the targets is the hard part. And so the question becomes is I've got this service, client service management information, well, what am I going to do with it? And so this is where it comes to service and process improvement. So we suggest using a model, and again, you can use whatever you want, but this is something that we find effective because senior managers kind of understand it. We call them tactical trees. And the nice thing about tactical trees is you can take a high-level intent and you link it right down to an individual tactic, and you talk about what you're going to get from, once you've completed the work. And so if I looked at the survey results that I got, this would be sort of a tactical tree that I might want to present. And I say, okay, it's clear that we need to improve communication between our front and second tier support resources. When I looked at those survey results, that's what we need to do. So my tactical areas are we're going to enable our technology to be easier to use for escalation groups. In my particular example, what happened was that the escalation groups weren't happy with the interface of the service desk tool because it was just designed for the frontline service desk people and it didn't work for people out in the field. And so to do that, what we were going to do is we're going to enable an iOS and an Android client. We're going to build a new interface for those escalation groups directly in the tool, and then we're going to train roles and communicate them out to the escalation groups, and then we're going to have some outcome measures where we're going to look at the percent of the tickets logged by the escalation group increase, because what we found was that there were a bunch of missing tickets. Okay? So the second thing that we're going to do is we're going to try and implement a first call resolution improvement program for our first tier resources. One of the things that we want to do is make sure that we're not escalating tickets unnecessarily to second line support because that upsets them. And so what we're going to do is we're going to implement a bunch of things here, and then we have a measurement outcome, and then I've got a series of measures. So the nice thing about this is that I implement my survey, I build out my tactical tree, I use my tactical tree to basically get management on board as to what we're going to do. And this now becomes sort of a project plan or a mini sort of task list, and we go and track and see how we do, and then we go back and just see whether we're getting improvements in client satisfaction or whether we're meeting some of those outcome measures that we specified. So I'm almost on time, a little over. But in summary, you really want to implement your customer satisfaction measurement around a methodology. It shouldn't really be ad hoc. It's really difficult to measure those things over time. Be careful not to ask questions that are not, God, I've got double negatives here, not to ask questions that are not relevant to your goals. So, I recommend that the goal should be about improvement. And so it allows you to really focus on the types of questions that you're going to ask. I see a lot of very self-serving questions that are often being asked that people sort of lowball out to their end users because they know that they're going to get really high scores. And I don't know whether that's necessarily that valuable if you know you're going to get, high scores on some sort of very lowball kind of issues. Use multiple data gathering techniques so results are not artificially inflated. So don't just do transactional-based survey. It's really worth doing annual-based surveys as well to talk about overall perceptions. Use client satisfaction as part of a CSI program as opposed to looking for satisfaction as a measure in itself. So, people say, I want to measure client satisfaction. Well, I say, nobody wants to measure anything. What do you want to do with the information that client satisfaction is going to tell you? And, I think the CSI program, makes the most sense. But whatever your goal is, that should be the reason why you're measuring client satisfaction. It shouldn't just be for a measure in itself, at least in my mind. Spend time focusing on how you're going to action the information. We often spend a long time focusing on how we're going to build out the survey, but then nobody spends any time thinking about, well, what we're going to do when we get the information. So think about those things like tactical trees, what's going to be the improvement plan that we're going to have to actually get these things implemented. Does our culture support that? What other changes do we need to make if we're going to action this information? And really don't be afraid to communicate results back to the stakeholders to share improvements and actions. It's a really great mechanism to improve survey results over time if you actually share results back to individuals. So one of the things that I mentioned earlier on is that we were going to give you access to some example questions. So if you go to a website, and I've got it up here if you just want to make note of it, it's thinkitsm.com/ThoughtRock. And what you do is you just fill out your basic contact information, and then you're going to be presented to a screen. And in this screen, there are sort of 3 surveys, okay, and there are just examples. You can click on executive satisfaction, practice satisfaction for IT practitioners, practice satisfaction for business consumers, and they basically list out all the questions that we've come up with for each one of these stakeholder groups, and you can either use this to send out the surveys, or you can actually just take the questions and put them in a survey management tool of your choice, and you can kind of go from there. So with that, I'd like to thank everyone for participating, and I don't know whether there are any questions.
Yeah, thanks, Charles. And again, I know that that's tough to crunch that into 40 minutes, knowing that that's a 2-hour workshop. So I appreciate you doing that. And I think it's definitely good educational value for folks that are on the line. There is a question, a couple questions here. So one question is, can you recommend a survey tool that would accomplish the suggestions made today?
I don't want to sound too self-serving, but on that link that I gave you, we built a template, a survey sending out tool that basically just follows this kind of like methodology. So and we just make it available for free. So if you go to that website, you can sign up. You can use that surveying tool. It's just a free service that we offer because it's something that we just don't feel that people should really get hung up about. And there's better ways of spending your money in terms of big strategic changes. So if you go to that website that I showed you, thinkitsm.com/ThoughtRock, you can take a look at the questions, and it follows this methodology.
Excellent. And there was another question about the presentation slides, and yes, these slides are available within 24 hours in ThoughtRock, so Charles's slides will be available. Just a quick other question, Charles, way back early on when you were talking about the argument for whether client satisfaction is of use to IT. Is there any argument to be made where client satisfaction is not of use to IT? It's in an ideal world. I think in a theoretical world, you could argue that client satisfaction isn't that important to IT, because at the end of the day, IT should be getting their perception of whether people are happy or not, from automated systems that are telling you what outages are actually happening. And we really even shouldn't be at the point where I'm calling a service desk. Amazon, for example, in a completely connected world, knows about issues before I even experience them. And so, that's kind of like the theoretical world. We're not there yet. And so in the practical reality, I still think that there's value in understanding whether our service is good enough that it warrants that people still use the service. Because the reality is we don't get those cost benefits if the service isn't usable. And I think those insights really come from understanding client satisfaction. Okay, great. Well, again, Charles, thank you very much. And again, like I said, I know it's a significant amount of content and a lot of information, and it's good that the slides will be made available. And as well, Charles, I'm not sure if on any of the follow-up slides if there's any contact information, but you can always reach out to Charles at ThinkITSM. I'm sure if you do a quick Google search, you'll find him, as well as if you send anything to ThoughtRock that's needed to get to Charles, we'll make sure that it gets facilitated over to him as well if there's any follow-up questions. And once people go through the slides maybe on their own, they have further requirements for some answers from you. So hopefully they can reach out to you directly if that's okay.
Yeah, no worries. Thank you very much.
Okay, excellent. So again, just want to thank everyone for joining us today. And again, thanks, Charles. Just a couple of things again in terms of next Tuesday, 12 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Again, Graham Furness will be here talking about is release management necessary? And I know Graham's got quite a following out there, and the key learning nuggets are what is release and deployment management, how are releases and changes related, and where does release and deployment management fit into the ITIL lifecycle. So please join us then, again, 12 p.m. Eastern Standard Time back on ThoughtRock. Otherwise, everyone have a great day. And again, one more time, I just want to thank you, Charles, for joining us, and hopefully we hear from you again. Thank you.